It does have fewer connections. We do know that female brains are better interconnected, and that will come up again in a minute. As of the day of birth, the left side of the brain is developing a little faster in girls and the right side in boys. Now, the point for that is that the left side of the brain is where the verbal center begins. So that's the reason why a 20-month-old girl has twice the active vocabulary of a 20-month-old boy. She simply is talking more. And when they get to kindergarten, she's better ready to start learning to read and to deal with the language part of school. Now, he's got the right side of his brain working faster. That means he can throw a ball more accurately at 20 months than a girl can. But school doesn't see that as important. And that's a mistake. Because when those girls get to be in pre-algebra and algebra, all of a sudden their lack of spatial skills are going to come back to haunt them. And all of a sudden we have girls that say, I can't do math. No, honey, but if you'd thrown a ball when you were 2, you'd been much better off. They're not going to do that. But we have a problem. You go into any kindergarten in the world, and you will see flat art, flat paintings. You don't need to teach that. Girls will do that. You need to teach them to build things, dimensional skills, doing things with depth to them. And then when they get to algebra in later years, they won't have the kinds of troubles. If you drew lines through your eyes and through your ears, at the base of your brain where those lines intersect are 2 very small pieces of tissue. One is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus develops earlier in girls. The hippocampus is responsible for helping us turn short-term memory into long-term memory. So does that mean that girls do better, remember things better? Well, our problem with that is that all our early memory tests are word-based. So if you ask a kindergarten teacher if the girls have better memories, they will tell you yes, but it's all for words. Boys do really well with remembering what they see. Boys have good picture memory. And when we're in kindergarten, we're so concerned about teaching them how to read, we forget about honing all their memory skills and saying, oh, do you remember how this goes, this picture? One of the things I frequently tell my boy students who will say to me, I can't remember the answer to that, but it's on the left side of the page with the picture of the so-and-so. I say, why didn't you start looking at the picture first? The words don't mean as much to you. Start with the picture, then apply the words to the picture. Then you're going to remember it better. It's one way for boys to remember. All right, next to that is the amygdala. It's a very much smaller piece of tissue, and it is what gets involved when we are upset, when we have strong emotions. It develops first and earliest in men. And so what I and most people who have raised a boy will tell you is that boys are more emotional than girls. Not just some emotional, lots of emotional more. The problem is they don't have the vocabulary to share it. So what they tend to do is, rather than learning to use their words, which we're constantly trying to tell them, but it's very frustrating. They don't have great examples on how to do this. We need to help boys develop that emotional vocabulary. Now, our culture says to boys, oh, don't talk about that. That makes you less of a man. So that's one of the reasons why we need to have men teachers in the lower levels to provide boys with examples of how to manage themselves. All right, and the last part of the brain to develop, right here behind your eyebrows, is called the prefrontal lobes. It develops earlier in girls than in boys, not surprising. And it's what's responsible for making us adults. It's what helps us make reasoned decisions and control our impulses. Okay? Now, you'll notice it develops in girls around 18 to 22, and in boys around 20 to 25, or 30. And you may have heard that number earlier today. The Minister of Education didn't know, he's a little aware of this research, and I said, no, the guy who did that research told me that it's 30 for many of the guys. And what happens is, we're trying to say to boys, you need to slow down, sit down, do your work, at a time when their brains are not really ready to do that. I'm a great believer for many boys in several years off from school. A gap year is great. They need that to have them settle down before they go back to university. What I get from their parents is, well, he'll never go back. And my answer is, well, he'll never waste the money then. Or his time. If he's never going back, what difference? I teach at my night class at the university where I teach is full of older students. And I have several guys who are on their second or third time around. One of them looked at me the other night and said, I really think I'm going to make it this time. I said, good. He said, I've come to every class. Just so that you know, there's a drug that really affects this part of the brain badly, and it affects that part of the brain, particularly the undeveloped tissue in that brain. So that if you take that drug in excess when you're like a boy between, like, let's say 17 and 20, you may permanently disable the adult portion of your brain. Would you like to know what the drug is? It's alcohol. I'm not opposed to drinking alcohol, it's the getting drunk on a regular basis. The brain is not designed, particularly the undeveloped tissue, is not able to manage it. So getting drunk on a regular basis for boys means that they may never grow up. And you may know a couple of men who are in their 50s who spent most of their young adulthood, their teenhood, if you will, being in excess, and that's why, is it affects that part of the brain. Girls have the advantage that their brain is pretty much developed by the time they may enter this behavior. It's really hard to explain to boys that this is not a good thing. All right, this is a result of a study that was done with children ages 8 to 22. What they discovered was that men's brains were less interconnected than females' brains. What that means is that if we asked somebody about a study, we ask them to remember something. What happens with the girls do this? You remember I said this the other day? Oh yes, says the girl in her head. That's kind of like this. And maybe, oh yes, and all of a sudden she's got the whole story. Because she began to start relating one thing to another. Boys' brains are like this. The information is all in here, and it's all there. But I asked the question when he was over here, and he can't link the two. One of the things that we have to spend a lot of time in with school with boys is helping them develop those links. And that's why saying at the first of a class, you remember last week class when we were talking about so-and-so, and the girls all go like this, and a third of the boys will raise it, and the rest of them are like, it's not that they weren't there, it's not that they weren't listening. We accuse them of not paying attention, but in fact, it's our fault. We gave them the wrong cue. Because we need to say, okay, guys, you remember last week when we talked about this, and I had this picture up on the board, or I showed you that, or you did this? Now I've got some more memory coming in. So it's simply a matter of our stepping forward. Now, by the time they get up into high school, we need to start teaching them how to make these connections for themselves. And they can, but when they're little, it's much harder. The study said that the separation occurred at a young age, increased over time, and they thought it was due to environment or culture. And my point is, until you can show me it doesn't exist in somebody under 8, I will believe this is biology made worse by the way we teach kids. So that's something you need to pay attention, is that we may make it worse, but they are born this way. Males, what they discovered was optimized for motor skills. What that meant was that if you had them do something, they could retrieve the information better. That simply telling them words was not good enough when you're teaching boys. You actually have to have them do something. So that's why my students are always fascinated by the bouncing green dot, because what that's doing is that's giving you something to focus at. Girls tended to combine that analytical and intuitive stuff so that if I asked a question, they could take that word and apply it in different ways. So that's what we want them to do. Boys can do it, just not as early as girls. All right, so the language concerns. So reading. I have one child. My husband and I were both very early readers. I was reading before